Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear is the real story behind La Cosa Nostra, the empire that ruled through blood, silence, and fear. Every week, we uncover the hidden truth behind history's most powerful criminal networks. Stories you were never meant to hear. Stay with us until the end, because this isn't just about crime. It's about power, corruption, and the price of loyalty. Comment your thoughts below and join the community that reveals what others are too afraid to tell. The story of La Cosa Nostra does not begin in the neon-lit backrooms of New York or Chicago, but in the scorched hills of 19th century Sicily, a land divided, humiliated, and desperate for protection. It was an island strangled by foreign rule, where power belonged not to the people, but to landlords and barons who owned everything: the land, the law, even the silence. In those days, justice was not written in courts, but carved into flesh, and survival often depended on who you swore loyalty to. Out of this chaos, a shadow began to form, a code of honor that promised dignity to the powerless, but would soon turn into the most feared criminal empire in the world. Sicily had been conquered by almost every major civilization: Greeks, Arabs, Normans, Spanish, each one leaving behind fragments of oppression and mistrust. By the mid-1800s, when Italy finally unified, the new government in Rome was too distant and too corrupt to care for the farmers of Palermo, Corleone, and Trapani. In the absence of state protection, local men, some brave, some cruel, took matters into their own hands. They became intermediaries between the peasants and the absentee landlords. They collected taxes, enforced contracts, and delivered punishment. They were called mafiosi, from the Sicilian word mafia, which at the time meant something closer to pride, defiance, and manliness. But that pride would soon find a darker purpose. What began as protection against injustice quickly evolved into organized extortion. The mafiosi realized that fear was a profitable business. Farmers who once sought their help were soon paying them to avoid harm. The pizzo, the tax of silence, became their law. If you refused to pay, your crops burned, your family vanished, and your name disappeared from the church registry. This system of intimidation created the foundation of La Cosa Nostra, our thing, a network where loyalty was currency and betrayal was paid in blood. The government tried to intervene, but most officials were either bribed or terrified into submission. The state's weakness became the mafia's strength. But La Cosa Nostra was not just about violence, it was about belonging. In the fragmented, impoverished villages of Sicily, where poverty and humiliation were daily realities, the mafia offered identity and purpose. To be part of La Cosa Nostra meant you were no longer invisible. You were respected, or at least feared. The initiation rituals were almost sacred. A new member would prick his finger, letting his blood fall onto the image of a saint. The paper was set on fire, and as it burned, he would swear, "May my flesh burn like this image if I betray my brothers." That oath was stronger than any marriage, any religion, any law. It was the birth of omertà, the code of silence that would define the mafia for centuries. By the late 1800s, the mafia had infiltrated every layer of Sicilian society. They controlled citrus production, one of the island's most lucrative exports, and used violence to dominate trade routes. Judges were threatened, police chiefs bought off, and mayors quietly bowed their heads. The mafia's control was invisible, yet absolute. Even the church, the moral backbone of Sicily, turned its eyes away. Priests blessed the sons of capos, and confessions were conveniently forgotten. For many, the mafia was not the enemy. It was the only justice that existed. The myth of the honorable man began to take hold, the idea that mafiosi were protectors of the poor, guardians of Sicilian values. But the truth was far more brutal. The mafia protected no one but itself. It thrived on misery, feeding off poverty like a parasite. Families were forced into silence. Mothers wept for sons who disappeared, and entire villages learned that to speak was to die. In those days, the saying went, "He who sees nothing lives longer." That silence became Sicily's curse and La Cosa Nostra's greatest weapon. One of the first recorded bosses, a man named Giuseppe Esposito, emerged as a symbol of this growing power. Born near Palermo, Esposito organized a band of enforcers who specialized in robbery, protection rackets, and assassinations for hire. When the Italian police tried to arrest him in 1865, he fled to the United States, carrying with him not only stolen gold, but the seeds of the Mafia's expansion overseas. In his wake, others followed. They spread across oceans, bringing their codes, their rituals, and their ruthless ambition. What began as a Sicilian problem was about to become an international phenomenon. Yet, to understand why La Cosa Nostra thrived, one must understand the soul of Sicily itself. It is a land of contradictions, beauty and brutality, loyalty and betrayal, faith and fatalism. The people learned to survive by bending, not breaking. They trusted family above all, distrusted the state, and saw revenge not as sin, but as duty. The Mafia exploited these cultural truths, wrapping their crimes in the language of honor. A murder was not murder. It was justice. A bribe was not corruption. It was respect. The Mafia did not just rule by fear, it ruled by redefining morality. By the turn of the 20th century, the Mafia had become so intertwined with daily life that it was almost impossible to distinguish criminal from civilian. Political candidates sought their blessings, businessmen relied on their protection, and police commissioners accepted their envelopes. The Mafia was no longer a secret society, it was the society. Behind closed doors, in candle-lit rooms filled with smoke and whispered oaths, decisions were made that would shape the destiny of entire cities. Sicily had given birth to a monster it could no longer control. As the century turned and waves of Sicilian immigrants began crossing the Atlantic, the disease spread. They arrived in New York, New Orleans, and Chicago. Poor, desperate, and carrying the only system of power they knew, La Cosa Nostra. In America, the opportunities were endless, and the corruption even more fertile. The Mafia's rise from the hills of Sicily to the heart of the American underworld was not a coincidence. It was destiny, born from injustice, nurtured by silence and protected by blood. The story of La Cosa Nostra's roots is not simply a story about crime. It is about how power fills the void left by fear, and how men who start as protectors can become oppressors. It is about how silence, once used for survival, becomes the language of domination. The Mafia began as a response to injustice, but it ended by becoming the greatest injustice of all. From those ancient hills, the code of Omertà echoed across centuries, whispering one truth that still haunts the world today. Once you let fear rule, freedom dies in silence. The waves crashed against the docks of Ellis Island, carrying not only the hopes of thousands of Sicilian immigrants, but the dark heartbeat of a secret society that had already learned how to rule through fear. It was the early 1900s, and America was a land that promised freedom, opportunity, and wealth. But for the Sicilians, who came from villages where law and survival were separated by a thin line, America was not a new beginning, it was an expansion. The Mafia had not come to die in this new world. It had come to evolve. The story begins in the overcrowded neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, where the smell of roasted chestnuts mixed with the stench of sweat and survival. The Italian immigrants were treated as outcasts, laborers for the factories, cleaners for the rich, men with calloused hands and hungry eyes. They spoke a strange dialect, distrusted the police, and trusted only blood. Within this isolation, the same conditions that had birthed La Cosa Nostra in Sicily began to reappear. There was poverty, there was injustice, And there was opportunity, the kind that only men willing to break rules could seize. By 1900, small mafia cells had already begun forming in American cities. The earliest known presence was in New Orleans, where Sicilian dock workers clashed with Irish gangs over control of the ports. When Police Chief David Hennessy was assassinated in 1890, it triggered one of the largest lynchings in U.S. history. 11 Italians were dragged from jail and executed by an angry mob. The headlines screamed, "Mafia," and America met the organization for the first time in blood. The message was clear. The Mafia had arrived, and it had no intention of leaving. As the new century unfolded, cities like New York became laboratories for criminal innovation. Immigrant enclaves such as Little Italy became fortresses, guarded by men who offered protection for a price. Shopkeepers paid to keep their windows intact, and anyone who resisted learned the meaning of Sicilian justice. Names like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano began to circulate. Ambitious men who saw that America, with its chaos and corruption, could offer far more than the dusty streets of Palermo ever had. The Mafia's evolution was complete. It had crossed the ocean, but it had not left its code behind. Then came Prohibition, the single greatest gift organized crime would ever receive. When the U.S. government outlawed alcohol in 1920, they unknowingly handed power to the underworld. The demand for liquor did not vanish. It exploded, and who better to supply it than men who had spent generations smuggling olive oil, lemons and guns across the Mediterranean under the nose of the authorities. The Sicilians were experts in silence, logistics and loyalty. They formed alliances with Irish and Jewish gangsters, creating a web of bootlegging operations that spanned from New York to Chicago, Detroit to New Orleans. Millions of dollars flowed in every week, and blood flowed just as freely. Joe Masseria, a thick-necked man with a cold stare, became one of the first true mafia kings of New York. His empire was built on intimidation and betrayal, a mirror of the old Sicilian order. His rival, Salvatore Maranzano, envisioned something grander, a hierarchy modeled after ancient Roman legions, where every soldier knew his place. The two men would soon ignite a war that would forever change the Mafia's structure and its relationship with America itself. But before that, a new generation was rising in the shadows, younger, more ambitious, and less bound by the old country's traditions. Among them was a man named Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano had come from Sicily as a boy, hardened by poverty and sharpened by the streets. Unlike the older bosses, he spoke English fluently and understood that America's power was not only in bullets, but in business. He built bridges between ethnic gangs, turning crime into cooperation. His alliance with Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, both Jewish, would rewrite the rules of the underworld. Where others saw rivalry, Luciano saw structure. Where others sought revenge, he sought profit. The Mafia was transforming from a collection of violent clans into an organized system, a shadow corporation with influence stretching from City Hall to Wall Street. But the rise of the Mafia in America was not just a story of criminals. It was a story of institutions that looked away, politicians who accepted envelopes, and police officers who preferred silence to danger. Corruption became the oxygen of the system. Judges were bribed, union leaders controlled, and newspapers silenced. In a city already divided by poverty and prejudice, the Mafia became an invisible government, feared by all, challenged by none. They bought justice and sold protection, a business model perfected long before Silicon Valley ever existed. And yet, beneath the glamour of bootleg whiskey and jazz-age power, there was rot. Every success story came drenched in betrayal. Friends vanished after dinners, allies turned informants, and bloodlines ended in back alleys. The Mafia's code of honor was being tested by greed, What once was our thing, a system built on loyalty and silence, was slowly turning into a machine powered by ambition and paranoia. The seeds of civil war were already sown, and the streets of New York would soon run red because of them. But in this moment of rise, in the smoky bars, the secret cellars, and the hidden warehouses, the Mafia tasted its first true empire. They controlled ports, unions, police precincts, and judges. Their money flowed into construction companies, bakeries, restaurants, and nightclubs. Their influence was so deep that politicians began courting them, not condemning them. La Cosa Nostra had achieved something unthinkable: legitimacy. To the outside world, they were businessmen. To their enemies, they were executioners. To their own, they were gods. America, the land of opportunity, had given the Mafia everything it needed and asked for nothing in return. The immigrants who once arrived in rags now ruled through fear and wealth. The code of omertà had survived the ocean, adapted to capitalism, and taken root in democracy. What began as a Sicilian answer to injustice had become an American empire of crime. But empires built on fear always carry within them the seeds of their destruction. As the 1920s turned to the 1930s, jealousy and power struggles began to tear the underworld apart. Old bosses clung to the traditions of Sicily, while new leaders dreamed of building something far bigger, an organization that could rule like a government and profit like a corporation. The stage was set for war, and in that war, the Mafia would crown its first true ruler. His name would be whispered for generations: Lucky Luciano. And the blood he spilled would wash away the last traces of the old world. By 1929, New York City was a city of smoke, jazz, and ambition, and beneath its streets, a silent war was brewing. The Mafia, once a loose network of Sicilian families running protection rackets and bootlegging operations, had transformed into a criminal economy worth millions. But success breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds blood. What began as a business rivalry between two powerful bosses, Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, soon erupted into the most violent internal conflict in Mafia history, the Castellamarese War. It was not just a war for money, it was a war for the soul of La Cosa Nostra in America. On one side stood Masseria, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, a man whose hunger for power was matched only by his brutality. He ruled through fear, demanding tributes from every Italian gang in New York. His enemies described him as a tyrant who saw himself not as part of the Mafia, but as its master. On the other side was Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian traditionalist from Castellammare del Golfo. He envisioned a purer Mafia, one that would honor the old ways of loyalty and hierarchy. To Maranzano, Masseria's greed had corrupted the code. To Masseria, Maranzano's ideals were weakness, and caught between them was a new generation of gangsters who saw both men as relics of a dying age. Among that new generation was Charles Lucky Luciano. He was young, ambitious, and dangerous, a bridge between the old world and the new. He had worked under Masseria, earning his trust, but he saw the future differently. Luciano believed that the Mafia could no longer survive as a group of warring Sicilian clans. To thrive in America, it needed structure, discipline, and modern vision. Yet to achieve that vision, blood had to be spilled, a lot of it. The war began quietly in late 1929. At first, it looked like a series of unrelated murders. A bartender found in an alley, a bootleg truck hijacked, a body floating in the East River. But soon the pattern emerged. Dozens of gangsters began disappearing, their corpses showing up with the signature signs of Mafia execution. 2 bullets to the back of the head, a coin placed in the mouth as a warning. Restaurants, clubs, and speakeasies that had once been filled with laughter now buzzed with paranoia. No one knew who to trust. Newspapers called it the Sicilian Civil War. The police were powerless. They didn't understand the code, the silence, or the deep loyalties that kept witnesses from speaking. Fear gripped the city's Italian neighborhoods. Mothers begged their sons to stay home at night. Priests whispered prayers for souls not yet dead. Every corner of Little Italy felt like a battlefield waiting to explode. Masseria's men ruled through raw violence. They ambushed rivals, bombed businesses, and used Tommy guns to make their point. Maranzano's men fought with patience and precision, striking only when certain of victory. For over 2 years, bodies fell across the 5 boroughs, in Brooklyn basements, Bronx garages, and Manhattan backstreets. It was estimated that more than 60 men were killed, but the true number was likely much higher. Luciano watched it all unfold with cold calculation. He knew neither side could win. The old world rules were destroying them. The future belonged to organization, not chaos. Slowly, he began to play both sides, pretending loyalty to Masseria while secretly aligning himself with Maranzano. His goal was simple: eliminate both bosses and rebuild the Mafia in his own image. The turning point came in April 1931. Masseria, confident he had finally cornered his rivals, invited Luciano to lunch at a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Villa Tamaro. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind that made New York shimmer with false peace. Luciano arrived early, greeted his boss with a smile, and ordered wine. They played cards, laughed, and ate seafood. Then, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. As he stepped away, 4 men, Vito Genovese, Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis, burst in and opened fire. When the smoke cleared, Joe Masseria lay dead, face down, his playing cards still in his hand. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another. Maranzano, now unopposed, declared himself the capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. He reorganized the Mafia into 5 New York families, each with its own boss, underboss, and consigliere. The structure he created still defines organized crime today, but Maranzano's victory was short-lived. Power had blinded him, just as it had Masseria. He began behaving like a dictator, demanding tributes and eliminating anyone he suspected of disloyalty. Within months, Luciano realized that Maranzano was no different, just another old man clinging to a crumbling dream. So, in September 1931, Luciano made his move. He arranged a meeting with Maranzano at his office in Midtown Manhattan, claiming he wanted to discuss business. But instead of showing up himself, Luciano sent a team of assassins disguised as government agents. They stormed the office, pinned Maranzano to his desk, and stabbed him to death. When the news broke, the city trembled. For the first time, the underworld had been reshaped not by tradition, but by strategy. The Castellamarese War had lasted nearly 2 years. It left behind a trail of corpses, shattered alliances, and a lesson that would define the Mafia for decades. Power is taken, never given. Luciano emerged from the bloodshed as the undisputed architect of the modern American Mafia. Gone was the feudal chaos of Sicilian bosses. In its place stood a corporate empire, organized, profitable, and terrifyingly efficient. After the war, Luciano abolished the title of Boss of Bosses. He knew absolute power only bred more violence. Instead, he created the Commission, a governing body composed of the most powerful family heads in America. Each family would control its own territory, but work together to avoid war. Decisions were made by vote, disputes settled in secret meetings. It was the Mafia's version of a democracy, or perhaps its illusion. The end of the Castellamarese War marked the Mafia's transformation from street gangs into an institution. It was no longer about neighborhood pride or Sicilian honor. It was about control of unions, ports, nightclubs, construction companies, and politicians. The blood spilled during those years had baptized La Cosa Nostra in American ambition. And though the streets would eventually quiet, the echoes of that war never faded. The ghosts of Masseria and Maranzano lingered in every smoky meeting room, reminding the next generation of bosses that peace was always temporary and loyalty always conditional. The Mafia had been reborn, stronger, smarter, and deadlier than ever. In the end, Luciano's victory was not just over men, but over an idea. He had killed the past to create the future. From the ashes of the old world, La Cosa Nostra stood as a new empire, one that would soon reach into every corner of American life, from the gambling halls of Las Vegas to the marble corridors of Washington, D.C. The war was over, but the real conquest had only just begun. When the smoke cleared after the Castellamarese War, a new order emerged, colder, smarter, and far more dangerous than anything before it. The year was 1931, and New York's underworld, once soaked in the blood of rival Sicilian clans, now moved with the precision of a corporation. At its center stood Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the man who had rewritten the rules of organized crime. He was not a king in the old Sicilian sense. He was a chairman, and his creation, the Commission, would transform La Cosa Nostra from a criminal gang into an invisible empire that mirrored the structure of American capitalism itself. Luciano understood something no other mafia boss before him had grasped. Crime could be managed like business. Violence drew attention, structure bred longevity, so he divided New York into 5 territories, 5 families, each led by a boss with defined borders and responsibilities. Disputes were handled not with bullets, but with meetings. The commission, composed of the nation's top mafia leaders, was established to maintain order, settle conflicts, and oversee joint ventures. It was the mafia's version of a corporate board of directors, and for decades, it operated so efficiently that even the U.S. government struggled to comprehend how deeply it had infiltrated the American system. Under Luciano's guidance, the mafia diversified. Bootlegging, once the backbone of its fortune, was fading after the end of Prohibition in 1933. But new opportunities bloomed like weeds in concrete. The mob moved into gambling, loan sharking, labor unions, and construction rackets. They invested in nightclubs, racetracks, hotels, and even Hollywood productions. Every business that handled cash could be touched, controlled, or owned. Through the unions, the mafia found the perfect front, the power to paralyze entire industries without firing a single bullet. Truck drivers, dock workers, electricians, and builders all became pawns in a game of extortion disguised as labor protection. The brilliance of Luciano's system was its invisibility. He and his allies rarely appeared in the press or on the streets. Instead, they let the legitimate businessmen do the talking. Money flowed in through shell companies, laundered through restaurants and real estate. In public, these men wore suits, shook hands with senators, and donated to charities. In private, they signed death warrants over cigars and whiskey. The mafia had become something new, an empire that operated within the law's shadow, but thrived because of its weaknesses. But even an empire built on intellect had its enforcers. Beneath the polished surface, men like Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello ensured obedience through fear. When someone crossed the line, a competitor, a witness, a politician who got greedy, the punishment was swift and theatrical. Bodies disappeared, cars exploded, messages were sent not with words, but with corpses. The code of omerta remained sacred. Silence was still the shield that protected everything. By the 1940s, the Commission's influence extended beyond New York. Chicago had Al Capone's organization, reborn under Frank Nitti and Tony Accardo. In Detroit, the partnership controlled auto labor unions. In Kansas City, the Civella family ran gambling and narcotics. The Commission was the thread that connected them all. A hidden government beneath the real one. Luciano had built something extraordinary, a democracy of criminals that mirrored the democracy of America itself, only more efficient, more disciplined, and far less moral. Ironically, World War II would make Luciano's reach even greater. When the U.S. Navy needed help securing the docks from Nazi sabotage, they turned, secretly, to the Mafia. Luciano, imprisoned at the time for running prostitution rings, struck a deal with the government. In exchange for helping safeguard New York's ports and aiding the Allied invasion of Sicily, his sentence was reduced. It was a deal drenched in irony. The United States, fighting tyranny abroad, had partnered with tyranny at home. In 1946, Luciano was released and deported to Italy, but by then, his influence had spread like wildfire. The commission was thriving, and his lieutenants, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others, carried his vision forward. Post-war America was a paradise for organized crime. The nation was booming, construction was everywhere, and consumerism was the new religion. The Mafia inserted itself into this golden age like a parasite with perfect camouflage. Skyscrapers, highways, casinos, many were financed with mob money. The Teamsters Union, under Jimmy Hoffa, became one of their most powerful tools, channeling pension funds into Mafia-backed ventures. In Las Vegas, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel turned the desert into a kingdom of sin. Casinos became the new bootlegging, legal, profitable, and limitless. With every spin of the roulette wheel, a piece of the American dream was quietly stolen. The Mafia's relationship with politics deepened too. Judges were bribed, police departments were infiltrated, even senators received campaign donations wrapped in loyalty. When President Kennedy took office, whispers spread that his father, Joseph Kennedy, had made deals with the mob during Prohibition. And when JFK's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, declared war on organized crime, the Mafia saw it as betrayal. Some historians still speculate that the lines between politics, intelligence, and organized crime during those years blurred in ways the public will never fully know. But with power came arrogance. By the late 1950s, the Mafia was no longer invisible. The lavish lifestyles of its bosses, silk suits, mansions, yachts, drew attention. Journalists began digging. Law enforcement agencies, once intimidated or paid off, grew more aggressive. Then came a moment that would shatter the illusion of secrecy, the Appalachian Meeting of 1957. Over 100 Mafia leaders from across America gathered in a quiet New York town to discuss business and territory. But the police, tipped off by chance, raided the meeting. Photographs of mobsters fleeing through the woods made national headlines. For the first time, America saw the face of its invisible empire. The government could no longer pretend the Mafia was a myth. Still, even after exposure, the commission endured. Its genius was not in secrecy alone, but in adaptability. When drugs replaced gambling as the next gold mine, they adjusted. When cities tightened law enforcement, they moved to suburbs, then offshore. The Mafia was less an organization than an organism, constantly evolving, impossible to kill completely. At its height, the commission was more powerful than many governments. It decided who lived and who died, who built and who burned, who rose and who vanished. It controlled unions that could stop the nation's supply chains, dictated the flow of billions in cash, and turned corruption into art. It was the American dream in its purest, darkest form. Ambition without conscience, success without morality, capitalism without limits. By the 1960s, however, the dream began to crack. Younger members grew reckless. Law enforcement, armed with new surveillance tools, started to listen. The seeds of betrayal were once again planted. But for now, in the golden years of the Commission, La Cosa Nostra stood untouchable. It had achieved what kings, generals, and emperors could not. An empire hidden in plain sight, powered by greed, silence, and the illusion of legitimacy. It was America's most successful shadow and its greatest hypocrisy. Because while the nation prided itself on freedom and justice, the real power often belonged not to the men in Washington, but to those who ruled from the darkness, the men of the Commission. For more than 3 decades, La Cosa Nostra had seemed invincible, a silent empire that ruled through fear, loyalty, and blood. But every empire carries within it the seed of its own destruction, and for the Mafia, that seed was betrayal. The same code of silence that once made them untouchable would, in the end, become their greatest weakness. The 1970s and 1980s marked the slow, painful unraveling of the Mafia's power, not by the bullets of rivals or the strength of law enforcement, but by their own men breaking the unbreakable oath, omerta. It began with whispers in prison cells. By the late 1960s, the Mafia's structure had grown rigid, almost corporate, but greed had eroded discipline. Bosses no longer lived by the old codes. They lived like celebrities, tailored suits, gold rings, and endless parties. They flaunted their power on the streets, drawing the attention of reporters, FBI agents, and ambitious prosecutors. The Commission, once a secret council of unseen power, became a myth that law enforcement was now determined to expose. And then came the first crack in the wall of silence. His name was Joseph Valachi, a soldier in the Genovese crime family, small time but loyal, until loyalty nearly got him killed. In 1962, Valachi, fearing for his life after suspecting his own boss wanted him dead, decided to do the unthinkable. He talked. Before the US Senate, under glaring lights and cameras, Valachi described in chilling detail the inner workings of La Cosa Nostra, its rituals, its hierarchy, its methods. He told America about the kiss of death, the making ceremony, and the oath sealed by blood and fire. For the first time, the invisible empire had a face and a language. The myth became reality. Valachi's testimony shook the nation, but the Mafia survived, wounded, yet alive. For a time, it seemed nothing could destroy them. The bosses continued to meet, the money continued to flow, and omerta was reaffirmed through fear. But beneath the surface, a new kind of threat was forming, one that could not be silenced with a bullet. The FBI was evolving, wiretaps, undercover agents, and a new legal weapon. The RICO Act, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors unprecedented power to dismantle organized crime from within. For the first time, the government didn't need to catch the Mafia pulling the trigger. All it needed was proof of conspiracy, and suddenly the entire organization could fall. Meanwhile, inside the Mafia, paranoia was spreading. The drug trade, which older bosses had once forbidden as dirty money, became irresistible. Heroin flooded New York and Chicago, and profits soared, but so did greed and violence. The once disciplined family structure began to decay into chaos. Younger members, raised in the age of television and fast money, no longer respected the code. They killed without permission, bragged about their crimes, and betrayed allies for profit. The Mafia was beginning to eat itself alive. By the 1980s, the cracks had become fractures. The FBI's surveillance was relentless. Bugs hidden in lamps, microphones in cars, and undercover agents disguised as businessmen infiltrated every corner of the underworld. Every conversation could be a trap. In 1985, the government struck its most devastating blow, the Mafia Commission trial. For the first time in history, the heads of New York's 5 families were tried together for running a nationwide criminal enterprise. The courtroom was packed. On trial were names that had ruled the underworld for decades: Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, Carmine Persico, Tony Corallo, and others. Over the course of the trial, prosecutors laid bare the Mafia's structure, finances, and murders, using evidence gathered from years of surveillance. It was the beginning of the end, but no one symbolized the fall of omerta more than Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Gravano was John Gotti's right-hand man, a loyal enforcer who had helped Gotti rise to power by orchestrating the assassination of his own boss, Paul Castellano, in front of Sparks Steakhouse in 1985. Gotti became the Teflon Don, untouchable in court, and adored by the media, a mobster who wore $1,000 suits and smiled for cameras. He was everything the old Mafia despised and everything the new generation idolized. But Gotti's arrogance became his undoing. The FBI wiretapped his meetings, capturing him insulting and blaming Gravano for murders they had both ordered. When the recordings were played back in court, Gravano's loyalty shattered. In 1991, Sammy the Bull became the highest-ranking mafioso ever to turn state's witness. His testimony sent John Gotti to prison for life. The unthinkable had happened. A mafia underboss had chosen the government over his family. The code of omertà, once considered sacred, lay broken. Gravano's betrayal sent shockwaves through every mafia family in America. If the underboss could talk, anyone could. Fear, the mafia's oldest weapon, now worked against them. The dominoes fell fast. More informants followed. Michael Franzesi, Joe Pistone, the FBI agent who had spent 6 years undercover as Donnie Brasco, and later Alphonse Darco, the Lucchese boss who became the first sitting head of a New York crime family to cooperate with authorities. Each one told the same story: greed, ego, betrayal, and the decay of loyalty. The Mafia was no longer the disciplined brotherhood of the old days. It was a fractured syndicate where everyone suspected everyone else. The psychological toll was immense. Members who had once sworn to die for La Cosa Nostra now lived in constant fear of their own allies. The code of silence that had once bound them together became a noose. Every conversation was measured, every handshake suspect. Inside the prisons, mafia bosses stared at walls covered with graffiti, not of loyalty, but of bitterness. The word rat became more common than brother. By the 1990s, the once glorious empire was reduced to shadows. The commission was crippled. Families like the Gambinos, Genoveses, and Colombos struggled to maintain influence, but their power was fractured by federal cases, internal wars, and the rise of new criminal organizations, Colombian cartels, Russian syndicates, and street gangs that didn't respect the old order. The mafia that once ruled America's streets now ruled only its memories. But perhaps the most painful truth was this: the mafia was not destroyed from the outside. It was destroyed from within. Every man who turned informant, every boss who betrayed his code for comfort or survival, every oath broken under the pressure of a courtroom, these were the nails in the coffin of La Cosa Nostra. The empire that had been built on loyalty had been undone by self-interest, and yet, in a twisted way, the mafia's fall was its ultimate confession. It had mirrored America too closely: ambition without restraint, loyalty traded for profit, silence broken for fame. The same hunger that once built the mafia's fortune became the force that tore it apart. The Code of Omertà had promised eternal unity, but in the end it revealed what the mafia had always been: not a brotherhood, but a fragile illusion of one. By the time the century closed, the golden era of La Cosa Nostra was gone. The names that once inspired terror, Gotti, Luciano, Genovese, became stories, echoes of a past world where power was measured in silence and death. The mafia had fallen, not with an explosion, but with a whisper. The whisper of men confessing into microphones, trading honor for safety, and breaking the silence that had once made them gods. The headlines declared it dead. The prosecutors celebrated. The FBI released statements claiming victory over the empire that once ruled the streets with blood and silence. But like a ghost that refuses to vanish, La Cosa Nostra never truly died. It adapted, buried its noise beneath the hum of modern life, and learned that in the age of surveillance and technology, invisibility was the greatest power of all. The mafia that once marched openly through New York's Little Italy now whispered in the boardrooms of construction firms, behind the closed doors of European banks, and in the encrypted messages of the digital world. Its power no longer depended on fear alone. It thrived on patience, intelligence, and the ability to blend into the very society that once swore to destroy it. In the early 2000s, when much of America believed the mafia was finished, the FBI quietly knew better. Wiretaps still caught faint echoes of the old world, names that had survived prison sentences, sons of former bosses now moving quietly through legitimate businesses. The five families of New York, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo never vanished. They evolved. The days of flashy violence and public executions were over. The new generation understood that blood attracted attention, but money made the world forget. They diversified their empire once again. Construction, waste management, shipping, and labor unions remained familiar fronts, but new industries emerged: internet gambling, counterfeit luxury goods, and high-level financial fraud. The Mafia of the 21st century learned to operate like a multinational corporation, leaner, quieter, and far more sophisticated. Gone were the smoky backrooms and whispered meetings in Italian restaurants. Today, deals are made in office towers, coded in digital ledgers, and disguised as international contracts. The rules remain the same: loyalty, silence, and profit, but the tools have changed. In Italy, where it all began, the shadow of La Cosa Nostra still stretches long, though its power has been challenged by rival syndicates, the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta, the Neapolitan Camorra, and the Sacra Corona Unita of Puglia. The Sicilian Mafia remains the spiritual core of the underworld. Its influence seeps through politics, real estate, and even environmental projects. Anti-mafia prosecutors like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino paid with their lives in the 1990s for daring to confront this power. Their assassinations, car bombs in Palermo's sunlit streets, were the last great roar of a wounded beast. But even wounded, it survived. For every boss imprisoned, another emerged from the shadows, bound by the same blood oath that has outlasted kings, wars, and revolutions. The myth of La Cosa Nostra has become its armor. Hollywood immortalized it. The Godfather, Goodfellas, The Sopranos. These stories gave the Mafia a strange kind of legitimacy, a romantic gloss that blurred the horror behind the glamour. Young men began to idolize the image, the suits, the loyalty, the power, forgetting the brutality that fed it. Inside prison walls and poor neighborhoods, the idea of La Familia still carries weight. It promises respect in a world that offers little. For some, it remains the only path to meaning, even if that meaning ends in handcuffs or a shallow grave. But beyond the nostalgia, the Mafia learned to weaponize modernity. The internet, once a threat, became an opportunity. Online betting operations in Eastern Europe, cryptocurrency laundering, and identity theft schemes all became new tools of survival. The Mafia no longer needs the corner store or the nightclub. It owns the algorithms. It has learned to hide in plain sight, within the very systems that define modern capitalism. And in many ways, that's what La Cosa Nostra always was. A mirror held up to the world's greed. The difference now is that the reflection looks frighteningly familiar. Law enforcement has changed too. The FBI, Interpol, and Europol no longer chase the loud criminals. They hunt the quiet ones, the accountants, the brokers, the men in suits who sign the checks. But even with global coordination, dismantling La Cosa Nostra completely remains impossible. The structure that Lucky Luciano created, decentralized, adaptable, and rooted in cultural loyalty, ensures its survival. There's no single leader to arrest, no fortress to storm. The Mafia is not just an organization, it's a mindset, an inheritance passed down through generations of silence. And that silence, the ancient code of Omertà, though cracked and bruised, still breathes. In the narrow streets of Palermo, there are shopkeepers who still pay protection. In New Jersey, a construction company still loses bids to certain names. In Brooklyn, an envelope of cash still finds its way to the right politician. The faces have changed, the accents softened, but the system, our thing, remains. The Mafia endures, not because of violence, but because it has become part of the social fabric, woven into business, politics, and even identity. To destroy it entirely would mean confronting the darker side of the very world that created it. The tragedy is that La Cosa Nostra was never just about crime. It was about power, belonging, and fear, forces that exist in every human heart. It promised protection to the poor, justice to the powerless, and family to the lonely, but it delivered only more chains. In its rise, it mirrored the American dream: ambition, wealth, success. In its fall, it revealed the price of that dream: corruption, betrayal, and silence. The Mafia was not the enemy of society. It was its reflection, stripped of illusion. Today, as investigators dig through encrypted messages and offshore accounts, they still find the fingerprints of the old world, traces of Sicily's ghosts, carried through bloodlines that refuse to fade. The young no longer recite oaths over burning saints, but they understand the rules: loyalty above truth, silence above conscience, power above everything. The code lives on, not as ritual, but as instinct. La Cosa Nostra no longer rules the streets. It rules something deeper: the memory of fear. It exists in the cautionary tales whispered by old men in Brooklyn cafes, in the monuments built for prosecutors who died chasing justice, in the uneasy laughter of those who still remember when one wrong word could end a life. It lives in the DNA of every institution that values loyalty over truth, hierarchy over morality. The Mafia's body may be buried, but its soul lingers, patient, quiet, and eternal. Perhaps that is the true legacy of La Cosa Nostra. Not the crimes, not the killings, not the headlines, but the silence. The same silence that gave it birth in Sicily's dusty hills, that crossed the ocean on immigrant ships, that echoed in courtrooms when men refused to speak. That silence, ancient and familiar, still waits beneath the noise of modern life. Because La Cosa Nostra was never just their thing. It was our thing, the reflection of every society that lets fear rule where justice should